All right, well, have you ever been to a foreign country? Have you ever, experienced the uncomfortable nature of, immediately coming into a foreign country? Specifically, for me, it was my first time. So, when Robin and I were just married, we had been married maybe 2 years. And I got this brilliant idea. I think I've talked about parts of this trip before. The whole trip was like an exercise in futility. But I got this really sweet Groupon to go to an all-inclusive resort in Mexico. And so we went to Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, during the rainy season in Mexico, because the Groupon was half off if you went during the rainy season. And so what we did is we got married and we flew from Dallas into Mexico. Now, I need to let you know, this is the first time I have ever left the country. The farthest I have been out of the country was Oklahoma, okay? And so going to Mexico was a completely different experience for me, completely different, culture shock and everything. And so everything, I felt like I was really prepared. When I booked our resort, I also booked our flight, and I booked all of our excursions, and I booked our taxi to get from the airport to the deal. I had everything planned out, right? I'm a really, really good planner. Implementing the plan was a bit of a confusing thing for me, right? So we land in Puerto Vallarta, and everyone had prepared me for the difference of culture and everything like that. What people did not prepare me for was the chaos that was going to happen inside the airport, right? And so we land, and I get off the sky bridge, and as soon as I step foot off the sky bridge, it's like a different world. So you've got people speaking all different languages. You've got people selling things. I had this one guy that was handing out shots of tequila to every guy that came. And at that point in my life, alcohol makes me nervous. So even being around it, this guy's handing out alcohol. Everybody's I'm seeing spring breakers taking shots and throwing back alcohol. It was the craziest thing. And so then we walk into the terminal, and you've got people shouting and screaming and trying to grab you. And I don't know where to go and get my prearranged taxi. And so I see this counter, and this guy, he grabs me. He can tell that I am, green as a vine. And so he grabs me by the arm, and he walks me over to his counter, and he sets me up on the counter. I think, okay, this guy's going to tell me where to go to get my taxi. And he's halfway through selling me a timeshare before somebody comes and rescues me. And so this, finally, an employee of the airport comes and grabs me and walks me outside and says, "You don't need any of that. You've already got this. Come find this taxi." That was the most frightening experience, 15 minutes of my life that I think I can ever tell you. And it wasn't because the people were frightening. They were having a great time. It was a party. They were happy. They were glad that I was in their country. It wasn't because people were being mean to me or because I was being jostled around. It was because it was a completely different language, a completely different culture, and a completely different place that I had ever been in my entire life. And so, why do I bring that up? I think that we are living as believers in a time unlike anything else that you have experienced in your life. I think that in the 21st century, in 2025, we as believers are living in a completely different country. People are speaking a completely different language, and they are living a completely different life than what we're called to live. And so I have titled this sermon or series, it's a collection of sermons that we're going to do over the next 4 weeks, called Believers in Exile. To be honest with you, I got this idea from a book called Digital Babylon by a guy named David Kinnaman, who researches teenagers and specifically the Christian community. It's a great book if you've got, a week to read a book. It's only, I say that, it's like you read a chapter a day, it'd be a week. You'd have it done in a week. But anyways, the idea is that we're growing up in a time where we are, in the book, they described being discipled by our screens. That we're spending upwards of 8 hours a day on our screens. And so what they realized in this book, in working with teenagers and working specifically with Christian teenagers, is that the world is feeding into us. We're being discipled by the things we're putting in our bodies. And so it's no longer, we're not living in a world where and I don't know, to be honest with you, that we've ever lived in a world where God's message is being fed into us all the time, right? And so how do we live in exile? How do we live as believers in a world that's already but not yet? That's what the kingdom of God is described in as the Bible. It's an already kingdom that's not yet come. How do we live as believers in this kingdom? So we're going to look at the book of Daniel. And we're going to see how some exiles lived as believers in a foreign country. And so we're going to look in Daniel, starting in chapter 1, and today we're going to cover verses 8 through 20. Daniel chapter 1, verses 8 through 20. And what I want you to kind of listen for and understand is, how do believers live in a time of exile, in a culture that's different than what they grew up in, with a people who are different than who they are, with a language that's different than what they speak. How do these believers live in exile? Daniel chapter 1 verse 8 says this: Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself, and God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. And so Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to him, to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat or water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating from the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. And God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. And at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And the king interviewed them, and among all of them there was no one found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they began to attend the king in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. So what we see is an interesting time in the Bible. If you want more context, you want to go back and read about what happens, you can actually see this story take place in 2 Kings chapters 23 and 24, and in 2 Chronicles chapter 36. But if you want just an overview, what happened is when David was king, Israel and Judah were a united kingdom. And then David had a son named Solomon, and Solomon was king over a united Israel and Judah. And then after that, when Solomon died, Israel and Judah split, and then you have a series of kings, which is what the book of 2 Kings is all about, the kings that come after Solomon. And it's a bunch of guys who are doing evil things in the sight of the Lord. So these guys are worshiping foreign gods, they're marrying foreign women, they're doing all of these things that were explicitly outlined in the Levitical laws. In the first 5 books of the Bible, God had written a plan for how Israel was to comport themselves in the world that they were in. The purpose of that plan was so that Israel would be a blessing to the nations. That God would see Israel, and the world would see that Israel was different than everyone else around them, and then they would come to faith in Yahweh, the one true God, and leave the worship of everything else. And so what happened was, instead of doing that, instead of being a light to the world, they chose to look like the world. They compromised their morals. They did all of these things. They went away from God. And so in order to punish them, God kind of continued to bring up oppressors. And so Egypt was the ruling power before Babylon, and Egypt came up and was ruling over Israel. And then when Nebuchadnezzar becomes king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar then overthrows Egypt's reign. And so the kingdom of Babylon actually extends down into Egypt and far east and far north and far south. It's a huge area. And so the way that Nebuchadnezzar had devised to control such a large geographical location is he would just take people and mix them up. And so he would take people from Israel and deport them to Babylon, and then he would take people from Syria or some other conquered nation and deport them to Israel. And so you would mix people up, and so people's cultures and religions and languages were all sort of mixed up. And so what happens with Israel is in 3 different phases, Israel gets deported, and they start with the royals and the noble families, and then they deport like the working class, and then they deport everyone else but like basically the destitute. They would leave the destitute in Israel, and they deported everybody else to Babylon. So this is what happens. This is where we are in Daniel's story. And what happens is, in order to deal with the influx of new people, Nebuchadnezzar deported the ruling class first, with the idea that I'm going to bring them into my courts, I'm going to enroll them into Babylonian culture, what Babylonian religion, Babylonian language. We're going to teach them language, we're going to teach them arts. At the time, Babylon was like the greatest empire that had ever existed. So we're going to bring them to Babylon, and then we're going to raise them up as Babylonians, so that when the next group of Israelites comes in, these Israeli Babylonians can deal with the Israelites. They can quell cultural confusion things, they can speak the language, they can do all of these things. But the purpose in these deportations was not to put these people in slavery, it was to show them how great Babylon was. And so in order to do that, in order to kind of strip them of their cultural identity, if you look at in verses 1 through 8, you see that Nebuchadnezzar actually changes Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael's names. He changes Daniel to Belteshazzar, and then Rakshak and Benny. That's how you know them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? But what we don't often get in English is why this matters. In Hebrew, names have meaning. When God does something in someone's life, he changes their name. Do you remember the story of Abram? Abram, when he has an encounter with God, when he gets into a covenant with God, God changes his name from Abram to Abraham, right? And so in the Hebrew culture, what your name means in Hebrew is a part of your identity piece. And so what Nebuchadnezzar does is he tries to completely even strip their religious piece from their names. Daniel's name in Hebrew means God is my judge. Dan-I-El. God is my judge. Daniel's name is changed to Belteshazzar, which means Baal or Baal will protect his life. So they strip Yahweh or God out of his name, and then they put in one of the Babylonian gods. Baal will protect his life. If you look at Hananiah, Hananiah's name means Yahweh has been gracious to me. Shadrach, which is the name that Hananiah means or receives, means under the command of Aku. Aku, another Babylonian god. So they strip Yahweh's name out of Hananiah, and they add in a Babylonian god named Aku. That Aku now is the commander of Hananiah's life. Azariah's name means Yahweh has helped me. Abednego, which is the name that he receives, means servant of Nabu. Again, Nabu is a Babylonian god. They strip Yahweh's name out and they put in Nabu. Now, the worst one to me, actually, is Mishael. Mishael's name is who is what God is. Who is what God is. Mishael and Meshach sound very similar, don't they? Because what the Babylonians did is they changed his name from who is what God is to who is what Aku is. They stripped Yahweh out and replaced it with a Babylonian god. And so these men who were Israeli Jewish ruling class at age 15 were taken from their families, taken from their country, taken from their culture, taken from their language, and placed in a country, a culture, a language that was completely opposite of everything that they had ever experienced in their life. These guys are absolutely in exile. And so what we're going to see today is that believers in exile do 3 things. Believers in exile have conviction over compromise. Believers in exile have confidence in God's care. And believers in exile have commitment to excellence. Look back at verse 8. It says, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself. What's interesting about this passage, and to be honest with you, what I realized in study this week, is that I have read this story once every 2 years for most of my life. I mean, it comes up all the time. We talk about this. We talk about Rakshak and Benny in the fire, right? We talk about the book of Daniel a lot. And so for most of my life, in looking at this, I look at the fact that it's Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael that are taken, and they're the only Israelites in this area that's happening. That's not true. Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael are the only 4 Israelites that don't compromise on their morals. The people that are taken out of Israel are a bunch of ruling class Jews. These are people with the same convictions as Daniel, Rakshak, and Benny. These are guys with the same upbringing as Daniel and the boys. These are the guys that have done the same things that Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael have done, and yet when being brought into Babylon, these guys choose convenience over conviction. They choose to compromise their own morals for the sake of comfort. And yet Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael choose conviction over compromise. Now, why would they be compromising? What would this be doing? They were eating the king's food. This wasn't bad food. These guys weren't being poisoned. This wasn't even really to be viewed as slavery. What they were receiving was food off of the king's table. This is the same food that Nebuchadnezzar would sit down and eat. This is good food that they're receiving. And really, the idea of eating from the king's table is to show you how great Babylon is. Look at how good Babylon is. Look at how we treat our guests. Look at what we give you to eat. The same food that our king eats is the food you're going to eat. The same wine that our king drinks is the wine you're going to drink. And so the rest of Israel that's deported thinks, okay, well, I'm just going to go about it. It's easier. This is the food I'm given. I'm going to eat the food that I'm given. But the problem with this is that all of this food, all of the meat, were meats that had come off of the altar in worship of Nabu, Baal, and Aku. And so these are the briskets that are left over when all of the smoke rises to Nabu, Baal, and Aku. So not only are they receiving different names, but they're saying, hey, you should eat this food because in eating the food, you're in an act of worship to those gods. When I would eat the smoked brisket that comes off of Aku's table, that I am worshiping Aku for the brisket that he's given me. When I'm eating the sausage links that come off of the grill in worship of Baal, I am submitting to the worship of Baal. And so it wasn't just that these foods were dietary restricted foods that God had called them. They were, many of them. But it was more than that because they would have been submitting to the worship of these Babylonian gods. We've given you Babylonian names. Our gods are in your names. And you should just eat the food that we're giving you. And then that puts you under the watch care of Aku. That puts you under the care of Baal. That puts you under the command of Nabu, right? And so all of these other Israeli boys, all of these other Jewish boys, all of these other royal families determined they were just going to submit. That they were just going to go with the flow and compromise on their morals. But for Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael chose not to compromise. That those boys chose conviction over compromise. Believers in exile have conviction in their beliefs. And with that conviction, believers in exile then can have confidence in God's care. confidence in God's care. Look at verse 11. So Daniel said to the guard with whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. These 4 boys had confidence that God was going to bring them through this trial. In fact, this is going to be a recurring theme both in the life of Daniel and in Rakshak and Benny. That in chapter 3, which we're going to get into in 2 weeks, that those guys look at Nebuchadnezzar and they say, throw us in the fire and we know that our God will rescue us. But even if he doesn't, we will not bow the knee. That they had so trusted in God's care in chapter 3 that they were ready to be thrown into a fire than worship God. In chapter 1, I don't even know if you caught this little discrepancy here. In verse 10, Daniel and the boys are talking to the chief eunuch. And the chief eunuch says, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men? You would endanger my life with the king. So the first guy they're dealing with is the chief eunuch. And that guy says, no way, man, you're going to get me killed. If I'm not going to give you this food, then Nebuchadnezzar is going to kill me for not being obedient to him. And so then the next guy that they're dealing with is not the chief eunuch, it's his servant, it's the guard. So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to them, please test your servants. And so this is now a second level down, and the chief eunuch wasn't going to have anything to do with it. And so they say to the guard, hey, you eat our food, we'll eat your food, and then just test us at the end of the time. And then whatever happens, you can do it to us. The chief eunuch was afraid for his life because going against Nebuchadnezzar, his wishes would condemn you to death. Daniel and the boys were directly going against Nebuchadnezzar's wishes. And yet they were leaving their very lives up to God's care. Because what they saw is that believers in exile can trust in God's care. They have confidence in God's care. That whatever the outcome, it's not up to me, it's what God is going to do. That God is sovereign over these things. That God is in control of my life. That God is the one who's going to control the outcomes of this situation. And so they say, test us, feed us what we're saying, don't make me defile myself, and then whatever happens at the end of 10 days, so be it. If Nebuchadnezzar wants to kill us, so be it. But we believe that God is going to be in control. And so at the end of 10 days, what happens? These 4 Jewish boys excelled more than the rest of these Jewish boys who were eating the king's food. These 4 Jewish boys who had confidence and conviction over compromise excelled in everything because they had confidence in God's care for their lives. They held their convictions over compromise, and then they had confidence in God's care. But they didn't stop there. With that conviction to their morals, to their religion, to their obedience of the law, and their confidence in God's care, they didn't just lay it down. They had a commitment to excellence. Look at verse 17 here. Verse 17. God gave these 4 men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind, and at the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they began to attend the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. What these guys realized is that their gifts, talents, and abilities were given by God. And so rather than just lay down and do the bare minimum in this land, they were actually working for the benefit of Babylon. That in this culture that was completely different than them, with a language that was completely different than what they spoke, and a religion, worship of gods that was completely antithetical to the worship of Yahweh, that these guys still used their gifts, talents, and abilities to glorify God to the best of their ability. They realized that their gifts, talents, and abilities were given by God, and that they worked towards excellence in those things. That these four, we don't know anything about the other Jewish boys, but these four were enrolled in Nebuchadnezzar's court. That they were his direct advisors. The most powerful nation in the world at this time is using 4 Jewish boys to advise the king. Can you tell me that's not God's care over Babylon? They're not even a nation that's worshiping him, and yet God has placed 4 people who are faithful to him over this nation. And it was because those 4 boys didn't lay down. They didn't just mail it in. That we've passed all the tests, we're good, we're not going to die, I can just mail it in until we go home. That's not what happens. They choose to work towards the benefit of Babylon. I was going to teach Jeremiah 29 next week. I think I'm going to teach Daniel 2 instead. But in Jeremiah 29, do you know, everybody knows Jeremiah 29. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. You know what Jeremiah's talking about? At this time, in Babylon, the Jews had some false prophets that were saying, hey, you guys ride it out. In 2 years, God is going to deliver us. He's going to send us back to Israel. And so all you've got to do is ride it out. And so in Jeremiah chapter 29, starting in verse 1, Jeremiah says, don't listen to those boogers. They're wrong. You're going to be in captivity for 70 years. And then you know what he says? Get houses. Get married. Find wives for your children. Find wives for your grandchildren. Settle in and work towards the benefit of the city. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to profit you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. That in the midst of this exile, God wasn't out of control. In the midst of this exile, God didn't take his hand off of them. They were under God's care, and yet the call on their life was to be excellent at what God had gifted them in the midst of exile. To work towards the benefit of Babylon. To work towards the growth of Babylon. To have a commitment of excellence because God had given them these gifts. So don't mail it in. You're not going home in 2 years. You're going home in 70. That God has given you these gifts, be excellent. And what happened with the 4 boys is that they were found to be 10 times better than anybody else that Nebuchadnezzar could find. That these guys were literally a gift of God to Nebuchadnezzar. That he constantly throughout this book, he comes to these boys and he asks for their advice, and Daniel interprets dreams, and Daniel actually outlives Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel, in verse 21 here in chapter 1, it says that he lives through the reign of Cyrus, who overthrows Babylon. Daniel's still there. And so they don't mail it in, that they're committed to excellence. So how does this apply to you, right? This is a really good story. How does it apply to you? I think that we are believers in exile. I think that many of you in this room can remember a time when it was a benefit for you or for people to be a Christian in America. I think that you can remember a time when people had business cards, and on their business card they had a little cross. And on their billboard on the street that they had a little ichthus fish. And when you walked into their business, that they would tell you that I love Jesus and I love America, and that's why you should do business to me. We in the business, we call that time a period of Christendom, where it was a benefit for you to claim the name of Jesus. It was a benefit for you personally. I think many of you can remember a time where things were shut down on Sundays, that you couldn't go to the grocery store because they would do like a blue light special on Saturday night, so you would have your groceries for Sunday because the grocery store was shut down. We don't live there anymore. And to be honest with you, the solution is not to go back to that kind of America. The solution is to have confidence and conviction in your morals. The solution is to have confidence that God is still sovereign, that God is still on his throne, that God is still in control, and that even in the world that we're living now, as believers in exile, that God is in control. And that we live a life committed to excellence. So what does that mean for you? You have confidence. You have conviction. When you're faced with situations in your life, in your business, where it would benefit you to just bend a little bit, you have conviction over compromise. It's going to make you more money if you just sweep this under the rug, if I don't just bring this up. I have conviction of my morals. I have a friend who he works for a company, and he made a mistake in a PowerPoint slide deck. And so he quoted this company a set of financials in one regard, and then he quoted them a set of financials in another regard, and it could have got him fired, basically. If he brought it up, it could have got him fired. And so the temptation for him, in fact, he reached out to me at the time, and he said, hey, man, I need you to pray for me because I made a mistake at work. It's probably going to cost me my job, but I have to go tell my bosses because I made this mistake. Why did he have to go tell his bosses? Because he had conviction over compromise. He could have swept it under the rug. He could have passed the buck to somebody else. He's not the main manager. He's not the main authority piece. And yet he went before his bosses, and he went before this company, and in both regards, he said, hey, I made a mistake. This is not the correct amount. I need to change it to this. Moral of the story is, I prayed for him, he prayed for him, his church prayed for him, he didn't get fired. But he stuck to his convictions in the midst of compromise. It would have been so much easier for him to just hide that, to not bring that up. He had to bring it up to his superiors. They didn't notice. Nobody caught it, except for him. What does that mean for us? It means that in the world that we're living in, we have to have conviction over compromise. But that also means we have to know what we believe. You have to study the words of Christ. You have to know what God has called us to do as believers. That I've got to submit to the authority of the words of Jesus Christ. I've got to have conviction over compromise. But then I have to trust, I have to have a confidence in God's care. I'll be honest with you, I struggle with this a lot. I have realized in the last, really since I started working here, that I have a hard time trusting in God's care. I'm a high-functioning worker. I'm a go-getter. I do things at a rapid pace, and because I do that, I can get it done. I can accomplish this. If I just work harder, if I stay longer, if I go do this and visit this and do that, I can get it done. And so very regularly I complain to Brenda about why are we dealing with this? Why haven't we solved this issue yet? Why haven't we implemented this program yet? Why haven't we done this yet? And Brenda very regularly says, it takes time. Just slow down. It takes time. That's a lack of trust in God's care, in God's sovereignty, in God's supervision. I think that we can look at the state of our world and alarm bells can be going off. People believe this, they talk this way, they act this way, they walk this way. And yet, I can't fix it. So what do? I live with conviction over compromise, and then I trust that God is in control, that God is sovereign, that God has a plan, that God has not forgotten about the people of the world, that God is in control, that He's still on His throne, that He's still moving, and that the call on the believer's life is to reflect the goodness of God, to point people to Jesus, the only thing that gives hope, Jesus. And then finally, I have a commitment to excellence. Paul says it this way in Colossians chapter 3, verse 23, whatever you do, do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people, knowing that you will receive the reward of an inheritance from the Lord you serve, the Lord Jesus Christ. Work with excellence, not for you, not for people to give you an attaboy, not for people to see how great you are, to build your own brand, your own kingdom. You work in everything as if working for the Lord. You don't mail it in. You don't go to work on Monday and you're tired and you've had a long weekend and I'm just going to sip through this coffee cup and kind of sit here and work into my workday. You work with excellence because God has given you those gifts. God has gifted you with your gifts, talents, and abilities for the purpose of giving God glory. That you exist to enjoy God, enjoy His creation, and to glorify Him in everything. That God has gifted you with the things that you're good at, with the things that you're interested in, but He wants you to work with excellence. So, how do believers live in exile? They have conviction over compromise. They have confidence in God's care, and they have a commitment to excellence.